Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. I'm Red Walrus, and I'm here to do something a little new. I haven't done a reaction video yet. However, in the last video I made about how the structure of video games, well, of how the structure of games more closely is aligned with music, there was a commenter who suggested that I watch this video. I've never done something like this, not on this channel or anywhere else. I'm kind of excited. I really like reaction content. I like to watch things with other people. I'll watch a movie that I love over and over and over again, as long as it's with somebody else. If there's anything, if you do enjoy it, or if you want to see me react to something else, feel free to tell me in the comments. And if I feel like it's relevant enough, then I'll love to do that. And if you haven't seen anything from my channel before, then what I do is I talk about games specifically from a designer's perspective. I'm a board game designer. Whenever I look at games, whenever I play games, I'm more focused on the design of them and the ludological aspects of it. In other words, what the gameplay is, rather than necessarily what the game as a whole is. And so I kind of frame all of my content around that. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm gonna kind of lower myself about here. So this is The Poetry of the Breath of the Wild by Writing with Andrew.
We tell ourselves that stories are everywhere. But what do we miss when stories are all we're looking for?
See, this is funny because I used the same opener for my last video about games and music, so that's kind of fun.
By the time I first stepped digital foot onto the open plains in the Breath of the Wild, it had accumulated years of praise. Somehow I'd managed to avoid any real knowledge of the game or what it offered. But by early 2021, I had heard a lot of people say that it was not just a good game, but the best game, their favorite of all time. And those are some pretty lofty expectations to live up to. In fact, because of that, it sat on my shelf for about a month before I decided I would finally see what it was all about and decide whether it really was as good as everyone was saying. Of course, The Legend of Zelda is a series of games that all generally see the player controlling the swordsman Link as he journeys through the kingdom of Hyrule, often to rescue the Princess Zelda from some diabolical villain.
I want to pause here just to briefly talk about my experience with this game. I have played Breath of the Wild. I've played a number of Zelda games, but by no means all of them. My first experience with the Zelda franchise was actually the Game Boy Color games Oracle of Ages and Seasons. When I was young, my parents had a strict no console policy in my house, but we were allowed to have Game Boys. And so one Christmas we got Oracle of Ages and Seasons for the Game Boy Color. And I remember playing those to the ground and then trading them to put our codes in each other's games to get the in-game content that they had, which was super cool. Beyond that, I haven't played a whole lot. I've played like the Minish Cap. I've played Ocarina of Time for the 3DS. And then I've played really Breath of the Wild, and that's it.
The details and story of each iteration vary, but the basic idea is the same. Grab a sword, vanquish monsters, fill your utility belt with weapons and gadgets, and save the kingdom. And with Breath of the Wild, the setup is similar. Again, we play as Link, and we have the charge to save the princess and the kingdom, but this time we encounter Link waking up in a mysterious facility. He stumbles out into the light to behold a wide-open world. From there, we learn that Link has woken up 100 years after an event known as the Great Calamity. 100 years before, Link had served alongside Princess Zelda and 4 other great heroes to prepare the kingdom to defend itself against a prophesied evil. But when that evil finally arose, all their preparations proved ineffective. The monster, Calamity Ganon, took control of their defensive countermeasures, defeated the 4 other heroes, and laid waste to the kingdom. And Link himself nearly fell in that eruption of evil, but agents of the princess carried him off to the Shrine of Resurrection, that same spot where he wakes up 100 years later, while the princess goes to the castle alone and exercises her divine power to seal herself and the monster within the castle walls. So our adventure as players begins in the ruined and dangerous remains of a once great kingdom. And with nothing but some raggedy clothing and a few tree branches to our name, it falls on us to finally defeat the evil that had won such a commanding victory a century before. But unlike other games in the series, Breath of the Wild takes place in an open world, which for the unfamiliar means that nearly from the start you can go wherever you want and do whatever you want.
I'm going to pause this real quick. This was something that I kind of bounced off of at first. Personally, I really have a tendency to not like open world games. The first console we got was PlayStation 2. One of the first games that I got was Grand Theft Auto 3 because of its reputation. And it didn't take long to realize that, like, I just don't connect with that at all. I tend to much prefer more linear experiences where I have the curated gameplay and progression that that is given to me. I don't know. It just always resonated with me better, and I don't know exactly why. But because of that, Zelda, the Breath of the Wild, actually kind of did bounce off of me at first. I remember playing it and having a hard time figuring out how to enjoy it. You know, once I got out of the tutorial island and I was just like thrown out into the wild, I was like, well, I could make a run for the castle, but I don't really know what's going on with that. And with the objectives it gives you, namely like the 4 divine beasts, I didn't really know how to approach that, which I think largely had to do with my inexperience with open world games. But regardless, it was something that it took me a while to get over and get into the game.
Obviously, you have the ultimate objective to defeat Calamity Ganon, but how you do it, when you do it, and what you do on the way there is totally up to you. Because the creators of the game can't know for sure what you'll do or when, they can't orchestrate well-timed reveals or twists. They can't create a plot that hinges on a character you may never meet, and they can't guarantee that you won't find some way to launch yourself into the air from a mountain, land at the top of the castle, and then defeat the monster with a ladle. As a result, the story of the game has to be flexible enough to accommodate any possibility. And if you listen to some of the game's critics, that results in a game with a story that just isn't very good. But what if it isn't a story at all? Even late to the party, I can affirm that my experience wandering Breath of the Wild's kingdom was honestly one of the more meaningful media experiences I've had, print, video, or otherwise. And I think one of the reasons it resonated with me so much is the fact that it works not like a story, but like poetry. And I want to show you today what I mean. Before I do...
So clearly this is why the video was recommended to me. I can kind of see where he's going with this, and I can really appreciate this. So what I'm assuming he's going to kind of start talking about is how the traditional like narrative of beginning, middle, and end and story progression from like I go from point A to point B doesn't really have a place in a game like Zelda. I've heard arguments, I don't remember exactly where these came from, but I've heard arguments that one of the issues with like gaming as an artistic medium is that what the player does changes the results of how the story pans out, because like it's a game, like the player has agency. The ironic thing about this, by the way, is I think in a lot of games this actually isn't the case. You know, like let's take for example Call of Duty. You don't actually have any agency over what's going on. You can pass the mission. You can choose to take different weapons with you. You know, you can choose to leave your AK for an M16, whatever. But that doesn't really affect anything. And ultimately, like the way it gives you the story beats, at best, there's like a choose your own adventure style thing going on. But for the most part, it's very easy to deliver a narrative because, you know, he says this and then he went there and then you go here and this happens. Now, whether or not that's a good pursuit for video games to do, that might be a good question. That being said, games like Breath of the Wild actually do kind of trip over that narrative issue where you don't have the ability to tell a cohesive story because you can do things in any order. You can skip this. You can, you know, one thing doesn't necessarily lead to another.
Though, I'm excited to share not a story, but my experience with today's sponsor, Shortform. Shortform offers guides.
I'm going to skip the ad. The tyranny of narrative. Nice chapter heading, dude. Nice B-roll for your chapter head.
You don't have to go far to hear people calling everything a story. Advertising is a story. Academic research articles are an exercise in storytelling. Your personal brand, well, that better be a story. Of course, stories are an...
As a guy with a background in public relations, absolutely nailed it.
Of course, stories are an important part of human experience, and I don't want to say otherwise, but I'm pretty sure that not everything is, in fact, a story. So before we get too far, we should probably talk about what I mean by story, and what I mean is narrative. In 1984, Walter Fisher published an article called Narration as Communication Paradigm, in which he argued that there are really two major ways of looking at the world. On the one hand, we have what he described as the rational world paradigm, and that holds that human beings are rational beings, that people make decisions through argument, that arguments follow certain rules in certain situations, and that rationality depends on a person's knowledge of a subject, argumentative ability, and skill in using the rules of a situation. And ultimately, that means that the world is a set of logical puzzles, which can be resolved through appropriate analysis and application of reason. This mode, Fisher says, has been dominant, but we make a mistake when we assume that it's the only way to understand the world. Sure, rationality has its use, but it's not the only way to make sense of the world and live productively in it. The alternative that he proposes is the narrative paradigm, which holds these core tenets. First, that humans are essentially not rational beings, but storytellers. Therefore, the true decision-making mode is finding good reasons from various situations, genres, and media. Those good reasons come from things like history, biography, culture, and character. Actual human experiences and stories rather than abstract rational rules. And that means that good decisions depend on our nature as narrative beings. That is, we can make decisions not based on rational formulas, but on our inherent understanding of things like narrative probability, coherence, and fidelity, or our ability to detect whether something rings true with the stories we already know. As a result, the world is not a series of logical puzzles, but a set of stories, and we choose among those stories to live the good life in a process of continual recreation. Fisher says...
So I'm just going to pause and talk about this for a second. So I like how he's laying out these different frameworks before he dives into how this affects Zelda. But I just want to take a moment to kind of talk about these two concepts as it relates to game design, because I think that there's a pretty interesting parallel. As a board game designer, one of the designers that I look up to and kind of, I guess you could say, study a lot is a guy by the name of Mark Rosewater. So if you're not a Magic player, then you probably don't know who Mark Rosewater is. So Mark Rosewater is the lead designer of Magic: The Gathering and has been for like the past 25 years or something. And in addition to being the lead designer, he also likes to talk a lot. He has a background in communications like me. He believes in open communication. And so he has a daily podcast that he makes about the design. He gives talks. He's given a really good talk at GDC called 20 Years, 20 Lessons, where he talks about the 20 lessons he's learned from 20 years of designing the same game. This won't be the last time I reference Mark Rosewater in this channel by any means. He talks about two different ways that he designs sets. Even though he's talking specifically about Magic: The Gathering, I also think this applies to games at large. The bottom-up approach of design is where you start with the mechanics that you want to focus on. So, for example, Magic: The Gathering is a game with each card is divided into basically one of 5 different suits. They're called colors, and these suits kind of make up one of the core structures of Magic: The Gathering. A famous and successful bottom-up set was Ravnica. This was 2001, I want to say. And in Ravnica, they started from the approach that they wanted to make a multicolored set. In other words, for the first time, they wanted the majority of the cards in the set to be 2 or more colors. Now, technically, there had been a multicolor set before, but it hadn't really it hadn't really delivered on their premise, and they didn't embrace it as much as they wanted to. They wanted this to permeate the set. And from that, what they decided was they broke up the set into 10 different color pairs, one for each possible color pairing, and designed this amazing world that's kind of like Venice, like a Renaissance era Venice, with this like massive sprawling cityscape. And it with like different guilds that have different ideologies, and it was a very cool set. And even though it oozed with flavor and like interesting storytelling as far as Magic can, it was at its core a story and a set built around this mechanical idea of color pairings. Now, the other approach you have is a top down. And top down, in this case, means that you start with the theme and the flavor of the set, and then design the rest, including the mechanics around that flavor. So another famous top-down set is a set called Innistrad, and this was a gothic horror set. And so what they did, like he talks about how they started off the meeting, design exploration meeting, with like, what is gothic horror? And they talked about, okay, like zombies, ghosts, werewolves, vampires, and they put all these things on the list, and different stories like The Fly and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that kind of stuff. And they said, how do we create a set that evokes these feelings? And it's cool because this set also had a lot of mechanical concepts that were pretty revolutionary, like double-sided cards, and have been affecting card design for, at this point, like a decade and a half, however long it's been. And so even though they started from a narrative perspective, it still had these really cool, it was still a very successful mechanical set. But I feel like this kind of relates to these two paradigms of logical a logical worldview and a narrative worldview. And it kind of illustrates the point that it's not that anything's wrong, it's that having access to both of them really gives you kind of the ability to it gives you the ability to reach in places where you couldn't if you were more narrowly focused and minded.
Traditional rationality is only relevant in specialized fields, and even in those arenas, narrative rationality is meaningful and useful. And I think the fact that you can have somebody coach you to write a better lab report by thinking of it as a story is pretty clear evidence of the way that narrative thinking has found its place in all kinds of human practice. So narrative is storytelling. When people say that Breath of the Wild has a bad story, they might be saying that its narrative doesn't live up to their expectations for narratives. It doesn't do the things that their experience with stories has taught them to expect. And what do we expect stories to do? Well, to give us a sequence of cause and effect events that take us on a journey from beginning to middle to end. Quoting E.M. Forster, Peter F. Neumeier writes, "The king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot." The author of Forster's plot had in mind a causality, a hypothesis, a point of view. And Kieran Egan writes that a key distinction sees the story as the chronological element of a narrative and the plot as the causal or motivational element, going on to say that a plot is a set of rules that determines and sequences events to cause a determinate affective response. Or basically, if people are fundamentally storytellers, that means that we're attuned to narratives that have not just ordered sequences of events, but plots, sequences of events that depend on causes and motivations. It's not just that one thing happened and then another thing happened. It's that one thing happened because another thing happened. The queen died because of the grief brought on by the king's death. And for people who are familiar with previous iterations of The Legend of Zelda, narrative with story and plot is the name of the game. Take, for example, my first foray into the series, The Wind Waker, which...
I'm going to pause this real quick just to comment. I think that before he gets into his kind of main points, I think that one of the interesting things that video games has a real opportunity to give you, and this might even be a little contradictory to something I said earlier, um, but I think that the cool thing, because he's right, by the way, like something like Zelda doesn't have, or like something like Breath of the Wild doesn't have the same opportunity to really give its viewers or its players a concise experience that follows the traditional structure of narration, where it's like he said, the king died and the queen died of grief. Well, okay, there's some of that in Zelda, because you defeated one of the divine beasts. They were able to help you at the end in the Ganon fight. But why did you do that? The divine beast? Well, because the old man told you. That's We're starting to get a little bit of a stretch. However, I will say that it kind of follows the paradigm of the silent protagonist. A lot of people say that Link is a silent protagonist because it allows the player to embody the hero. Link is a literal link between you and the game. That's literally what Avatar means. They're something that allows you to put yourself in their place. And because of that, I think there's a lot of opportunity in games, and certainly in Breath of the Wild, where you create your own narrative. For me, I look back at that, and like I said, I played it. I didn't do like a whole lot. I didn't explore every aspect that the game had. But I did have this experience where, like, one of my big goals in the game was to get the Master Sword before I went and fought Ganon. And because of that, I had this, like, okay, I need to do this in order to get more hearts and in order to pull the Master Sword. And I need to explore over here because I think this might be a good avenue. Now I need to find the route to the forest. And all of that kind of created this, like, internal narrative that nobody else has. At least nobody else has the same one, because I was able to assign my own motivations and my own kind of causal relationship. And so I think that, I don't know if he's going to get into it, but I like that games like Breath of the Wild, they don't necessarily need to have a good story, because if they have a good world and good gameplay, then the good story will come from the experience the player has himself.
Spoilers ahead, ends with Link defeating the evil King Ganondorf, turning him to stone with the power of the Master Sword. And thinking in terms of causes, why does that happen? Because the good King of Hyrule made a wish through the powerful artifact known as the Triforce that Ganondorf would be defeated. Why does that happen? Because Ganondorf, who possessed part of the Triforce, kidnapped the princess, who also possessed part of it, which then drew Link, possessor of the third fragment, to confront Ganondorf and save the princess. When the Triforce was reassembled, the good king had his chance to make his wish. But why does Link even feel like he can take on this ultimate evil in Ganondorf? Because he just completed a journey to restore the power of his legendary sword. And why did he do that? Well, because he had already confronted Ganondorf once before with a weakened sword and was summarily defeated. Okay, but why was he fighting him in the first place? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's because a giant bird kidnapped Link's sister at the beginning of the game, and Link was trying to rescue her. Why did that bird kidnap his sister? Because his sister looked like Princess Zelda, and Ganondorf had commanded the giant bird to kidnap anyone who looked like Zelda, blah blah blah, so that he could reassemble the Triforce and rule the world, or whatever. Long reverse story short, previous to Breath of the Wild, Zelda games like The Wind Waker were largely narrative experiences. They had stories and plots. You started the game and played your way through a controlled sequence of events that all had clear causal relationships with one another. All the way throughout, you knew Link's motive and you knew other characters' motives. And each step along the way had a clear purpose in contributing to the overall goal. Why did you fight the weird bug and weird plant before you fight the weird ghost and snake? Because you have to find the sword because you can power it up. There's an order to things, and that order is fundamental to the narrative. But now look at Breath of the Wild, which says...
So I like what he's saying. One small issue I want to take with what he's saying is that I think that there's this great video that I'd recommend you watch if you haven't. I think it's called "The Question Nobody Asks," and it's talking about kind of the design aims of that Miyamoto has with each Zelda game, and to give you the too long didn't watch of it, Miyamoto wants to capture the feeling of a boxed garden, or like a little garden that you can have on your desk or on your back porch or whatever, that evokes a larger world by using the feelings and kind of hinting the viewer in the direction of aspects of a larger world. So one of the things that Miyamoto thinks is the most successful Zelda game to date is actually the first Zelda game, The Legend of Zelda for the NES. The cool thing about that is that because of the limits of the original hardware, the ways that it conveyed the story to you, the ways that it conveyed the experience to you, were done in ways that really keyed the mind's eye, the imagination of the player to fill in the gaps and create a world that was larger than the one on screen. And as Zelda games have been released, they've kind of been taken further and further into that direction of like heavy narrative. And so the issue I want to take is I think he's right, but also I think that Breath of the Wild wasn't so much a departure from that like narrative storytelling as a return to form of the original aims of the Zelda franchise and ultimately what Miyamoto wants from the games all along.
You got to beat the big guy in the middle, but do whatever you want in the meantime. With a setup like that, there can't be a story, because the game can't predict what order you do things in. And then, of course, there can't be a plot, because lack of sequence aside, there's no real way to establish a causal link between one action and another. Why did you go visit the snowy Rito village first instead of the desert Gerudo town? No reason. You just felt like going north instead of south. How does spending 2 hours looking for mushrooms to dye your shirt a different color help you to defeat the evil monster? It doesn't. But while you were doing it, you stumbled on an ancient shrine and solved a tricky puzzle inside, and you thought that was pretty cool. Why are you launching yourself off a tower and seeing how far away you can glide? Well, do you need a reason other than the background music?
This guy's wearing a nice beret.
If you're expecting a narrative experience like the step-by-step sequence of something you'd find in The Wind Waker, you probably are going to be disappointed by the experience that Breath of the Wild gives you. Because not only doesn't it deliver a structured narrative, it can't. Because it leaves things open and gives a player freedom to do whatever they want, however they want, a structured narrative is impossible. So yeah, put simply in those terms, Breath of the Wild does have a bad story, and critics will acknowledge that the game design decision to create an open world, which translates into a lot of freedom and enjoyable gameplay, comes at the necessary cost of story. It is a lot of fun to play, they'll say, but it's just a shame that the story has to suffer as a result. And there are some...
I think that I really like the direction he's going, by the way. I absolutely agree with what he's saying. One of the things he says is that it makes a structured narrative impossible, which I think is accurate. However, I don't think, as I was kind of saying before, I don't think a narrative is impossible. The designers have to trust the player to fill in those gaps and do a lot of the narrative heavy lifting themselves. I also think that one of the things he said before I paused was that a lot of the critics will say it's a shame it had to come at the cost of the story. I do not agree with that sentiment at all. I think that in this case, I think that those two things kind of are kind of like deeply opposed to each other. In order to have the experience that that the Zelda team wanted to deliver with Breath of the Wild. It's not only that in order to do the open world the way they wanted to, you had to have a mediocre story. It's that in order to have the experience to be the way that they wanted, you couldn't have a strong story. Because if you had a strong story, it gives the player less room to color that story and that adventure in themselves. It's the difference of having your own adventure, setting out for your own way, versus playing a little bit and then going from cutscene to cutscene and then having the game tell you what's happening and then kind of playing the next area. You know, a good example of this is like Uncharted, where like it really does feel like you're playing a little arcade shooter in between these story beats. There's a different logic that the world has in cutscenes than it does in gameplay, and that has a traditionally strong narrative. However, it comes at the sacrifice of the player experience, allowing the player to have their own experience treasure hunting. You don't have your own experience, you have Nathan Drake's experience. And I'm not bagging on those games. Those games were delightful, but the experience that Zelda Breath of the Wild wanted to deliver couldn't exist in a situation with a strong narrative focus.
Narrative elements to this game. There's the broad framing of the overall objective, the large cause of the calamity leading to the large effect of fighting Calamity Ganon. But there are also a series of locations in the Kingdom of Hyrule that, when you go there, trigger flashbacks of Link's life before everything was destroyed. In those flashbacks, we catch glimpses of Link and his fellow champions preparing for the foretold calamity, doing things like working on guardian robots, studying ruins, accompanying the princess as she tries to awaken her divine anti-calamity powers. And we also see the immediate aftermath of the calamity's eruption, the destruction, the defeat, the despair of it all. And that's the more interesting story, people will say. The story I want to play through is the one that happened 100 years ago, the one with all these characters with clear motives, the ones that make interesting choices to overcome tangible challenges. But instead, we're just here, in a field. We're breaking our swords over and over until, what, we get enough hearts to feel like we can fight the big bad guy? I mean, it might be fun to mess around in an unstructured Hyrule, but that doesn't change the fact that the story of the game just isn't that good. Certainly not as good as the story before the game, the story that it teases us with every so often. But
this sounds like a criticism that comes out of a college creative writing class, right? Like, start your story at the interesting point. Start it at the end of the world, not 100 years after the end of the world. And I'm assuming he's gonna go into why that would be bad advice for a game like Breath of the Wild and would have created a worse experience, or at least a different experience.
But hey, listen, what if that's the wrong way to think about it? The narrative paradigm offers some meaningful and meaningfully humane alternatives to the rational paradigm. But what if, in our wholehearted embrace of storytelling as the basic impulse of the literary arts, novels, movies, or video games, we've done ourselves a disservice and limited our ability to see a whole range of other ways to craft literary experiences? What if critics saying that Breath of the Wild has a bad story is like philosophers calling rhetoric bad philosophy? Saying that Breath of the Wild has weak storytelling is only a meaningful critique if it's trying to tell a story. Mm-hmm. But what happens if we look at this game not as narrative fiction, but as poetry?
It's like complaining that a movie like Dead Poet Society doesn't have enough action sequences. It was boring. From the tyranny of narrative.
Time spent in Breath of the Wild's open world is time spent doing things like hunting for lizards in volcanic wastelands, or sneaking up on sleeping monsters to steal their fish, or even catching fireflies to brighten an old lady's day. Maybe you're wandering through the wetlands and see something sparkle in the distance, so you go to see what it's all about. Maybe you're in the desert, caught unawares by a big old sand monster. More likely, though, you'll probably find yourself running in circles during a rainstorm, waiting for the weather to clear so that you can climb a mountain without sliding back down to the bottom. Maybe, after dodging a terrifying monster at the foot of a volcano, your panic is interrupted by a breeze carrying a melody that draws your gaze up, unexpectedly, to a dragon peacefully crawling its way through the sky.
Some
None
of
of
my
this
favorite
feels like
moments in these
narrative's
games.
process of causal completion. Instead, it feels more like what the sociologist Andrew Abbott describes in his piece, Against Narrative, a preface to lyric sociology. As he analyzes Harvey Zorbaugh's writing about Chicago, he says, telling a story is precisely what Zorbaugh does not do. He rather looks at a social situation, feels its overpowering excitement and its deeply affecting human complexity, and then writes a book trying to awaken those feelings in the minds and even more in the hearts of his readers. This recreation of an experience of social discovery is what I shall here call lyrical sociology. And like Abbott does with Zorbaugh, I would argue that telling a story is precisely what Breath of the Wild does not do. When you're lost in the woods and you hear some familiar accordion music and then happen upon your bird-shaped friend, that's not a plot point. When you're zipping up the canyon in the Gerudo Desert on your way to infiltrate the Yiga hideout, you're not cruising along the rising action curve of any one of the 48 plot structures theorists have devised. When you're throwing bombs at trees to gather wood instead of looking for an axe that would just break anyway, you're not discovering something about Link's backstory or motivations. In each of those cases, and at any point when you're playing the game, you're just living in a moment, having an experience, and not much more. And Abbott goes on to say, the lyrical is momentary. This, above all, is what makes it non-narrative. It is not about something happening. It is not about an outcome. It is about something that is, a state of being. A narrative writer seeks to tell us what happened and perhaps to explain it. A lyrical writer aims to tell us of his or her intense reaction to some portion of the social process seen in a moment. This means that the first will tell us about sequences of events, while the second will give us congeries of images. Ask someone to...
I really like how this this kind of takes something that somebody might say is a piece of criticism and acknowledges that it's not bad. In fact, it's better this way. That like the ability, it's not a bad thing that it's not a narrative failing that these things are singular moments that don't necessarily have to be connected to anything. Rather, if something is connected to everything, then it ties you down into this restrictive experience. I think with games, you know, I'm just kind of like riffing here, but a big way that like, especially this was popular in like 2000s games, you would the way that it would like tell the games would tell their stories is by giving you morality choices, and if you took enough morality choices, then you would get the, if you took enough good choices, you would get the good ending. If you took enough bad choices, you would get the evil ending. One of the games that really sticks out to me in my memory is a game called Infamous for the PS3, where you're like a literal superhero, and if you take bad choices, then you will literally turn in, like, you shoot lightning, right? And your lightning will turn red. And if you take good choices, your lightning will turn blue. And so, like, you'll also gain access to different powers. All of this was very cool. Infamous was a really fun game. I really loved it. But that being said, it made it so that these moments were restrictive. If you're given a situation, even though it's like pretty ham-handed, like, oh look, there's a woman tied up to a phone pole. Do you free her or do you kill her? Haha! Killing her is the bad choice. And like, okay, sure, whatever. But because you're trying to gain an aim, or because you're aiming for a specific end, you don't have as much freedom to play around with the possibilities. You don't have the opportunity to see if you throw things at the lady, then if she'll swing, and that'd be kind of funny or whatever. And I think that there's kind of something lost when everything's connected to itself and not allowed to just kind of live and breathe in the moment.
to tell you about what happens in The Wind Waker, and they'll probably give you a plot summary. They can even give you explanations for why certain things happened in the order that they did. But ask someone to tell you about the time they played Breath of the Wild, and you'll probably just get congeries of images. That's because Breath of the Wild isn't a narrative experience, it's a lyrical one. Naturally, while writing this script, I asked YouTube to play some of the greatest hits from the game's soundtrack, and reading those comment sections feels a lot like reading poetry. People are writing about those primary, unstructured experiences that they had while playing. The intense emotions recollected in tranquility that Wordsworth said poetry was all about. What people remember about the game, at least what they choose to comment on soundtrack music videos about, are those lyrical experiences. The poetry that the game is made of. They might not fully recognize it all as poetry, but poetry is essentially what they're doing. And that's what we miss when we see everything through the lens of story. It's also why I tell new readers of poetry that poetry doesn't tell stories. Which, of course, isn't to say that poetry can't have narrative elements to it. But if you go into a poem thinking that it will tell a story the same way a novel or TV show does, you're going to be putting narrative expectations onto lyrical texts, and you'll probably come away saying it's a bad story. Or maybe you'll just be confused and frustrated because you understand stories, but you just don't get this poetry stuff. Right? Because the tools of narrative won't help you here, or at best, they'll only get you so far. So yeah, from a narrative perspective, the memories or flashbacks in Breath of the Wild might seem like a frustrating tease, that they're just the story the game could be telling if it weren't so stuck on being an open-world game. But consider those flashbacks from a lyrical perspective. What happens when we see them not as a desperate attempt to accommodate narrative to a difficult game genre, but as a meaningful element of the game's lyrical framework? You're experiencing life through the eyes of Link, a hero who woke up 100 years after nearly dying in the Great Calamity, and without any of his former memories. You could play the whole game to the end without activating any of the flashbacks, but what is it like to navigate a world full of monsters? A world where most of the people have retreated to a few small towns, where irritating lizards, the heat, and even bees are always trying to kill you, to say nothing of the giant patrolling robots that come out of nowhere with frantic piano music and giant blue lasers, only to have the world around you pause while you witness a day 100 years ago where your friends are testing the very robots that were meant to protect the kingdom, but that are now hunting you. The memory is not a weak attempt to get story into the game. It's a scrap of narrative that changes your lyrical experience now.
So one of the development studios who I think does this beautifully is FromSoft. And I know, I'm making a design video and talking about Dark Souls, haha. But when I think about the cutscenes of Bloodborne specifically, a lot of the cutscenes, not all of them, a lot of the cutscenes have no meaningful impact on anything. When you enter the cathedral ward, you look at the architecture. And that's it. I think when you encounter the cleric beast just jumps out at you. It's been a while since I played Bloodborne, but any given cutscene that Bloodborne has is just you encountering the moment, looking at the environment, with a few notable exceptions, like when you defeat Rom. I think it's really cool because cutscenes are impactful for a developer to add. They aren't like, sure, we'll throw a cutscene here, especially in a game like Bloodborne, which doesn't have many at all. And so if there aren't a lot of something, and you kind of have to stop and ask yourself why they're putting it in here now. And I think what FromSoft really emphasizes with their cutscenes is atmosphere and environment, rather than emphasizing narrative. Because Bloodborne has, and Bloodborne actually has a stronger narrative than most of the other FromSoft games. They really want that narrative to come from you rather than be given to you. And so I feel like it gives you these really cool moments to really just look at what they want you to look at so that you enter into this new environment with the feeling that they want you to have.
You keep running from the robots or start facing them down, it means something different after seeing the flashback than before. It makes the emotional experience in the moment, the lyrical now, a different experience. And when you restore your memories of all the other champions and see, for example, how Urbosa cared for Zelda almost like a mother 100 years ago, it means something different to see her spirit perched in a giant camel robot taking aim at the monster in the castle, ready for the moment that you decide to confront the beast. So, and of course the developer's intentions don't really matter here, because we as players have the choice. We could read those flashbacks as a weak and mostly unsuccessful effort to put a story in a game that is mechanically at odds with storytelling, or we could read them as narrative elements that serve to enrich and deepen a primarily lyrical text. To treat Breath of the Wild as a failed narrative...
Using the music analogy, these are almost like samples. They're things that from a different piece that you bring in to evoke that feeling and to kind of like talk about that. And I think that's kind of cool.
It would be to misunderstand how it works. It's not a bad story, it's poetry that draws on narrative elements here and there to achieve its effect. In a story, there's always somewhere to be and something to do, always a cause affecting your actions. With a poem, though, it can be, and often is, enough just to sit on a snowy ridge and watch the sunrise. Where narrative attempts to organize moments and events into grand dramas, the lyric is content just to be, to observe, to ponder. And for whatever narrative elements Breath of the Wild has, most of the time you spend in the game isn't trying to fit your actions into a plot. You don't need a reason to deck yourself and your horse in futuristic ancient technology to go bopping bokoblins in the head. There's no plot motivation for hanging your favorite shields in your house, and the story isn't going to change if you take a piece of royal fruitcake with you when you finally go to rescue Zelda. But all of it can and will change how you inhabit the moment-to-moment experiences of wandering a kingdom 100 years too late to save it. For me, time and again, the most meaningful experiences came when activating one of the many towers that dot the kingdom. In the game, the towers are said to have been constructed by an ancient people in order to help in the fight against the calamity. And in practical gameplay terms, they serve to give you sections of your map. But the poetry of them, the experience in the moment, at least for me in early 2021, meant a whole lot. See, these towers are scattered throughout the land, and getting to the top of each one requires some problem solving and a lot of patience. It is, after all, a long climb. But then, when you do get to the top and activate the tower, you're rewarded with a grand musical sweep that accompanies the sweeping view of the surrounding area. And each time, even though those towers don't really do anything, I experienced it as if the lights of hope were being turned on in a ruined and desolate kingdom. And it was an experience that seemed to say that even if it comes 100 years later than you wanted, and even if it's just you against an immeasurable evil, it's still possible for good to triumph. It was something that mattered not because of how it fit into a narrative sequence, but because of what it was like to experience it in the moment. It was...
As he points out, this is like early 2021, so you gotta figure that there also might be some of that like experience of being able to look around and feel this expansive area that's connected with this feeling of hope that maybe there's more reasons why that they really connected with him at that time, which is, I think, really cool.
In a word, poetry. Stories are important, and to be sure, they show up in all kinds of places. But when we treat story as the fundamental or only way of communicating human experience, we stand to overlook and misunderstand a lot of meaningful things. 40 years ago, Fisher argued that the rational paradigm wasn't the jack of all trades that it was thought to be, and that its usefulness was really constrained to specialized fields where it did work exceptionally well. In the years since, his alternative, narrative, has almost come to fill a similar role, and you won't have to go far to hear people trying to explain the whole world in terms of story. But just as there are things where rationality fails to offer satisfying accounts of our experience, narrative falls short of giving us universal understanding. Sometimes things just aren't stories. They don't have plots with beginnings, middles, and ends. I'd argue that in most cases, life refuses to conform to narrative structures, and in a lot of our media, narrative expectations keep us from seeing what's really going on. So you could say that your life, or even your Zelda game from almost a decade ago, has a bad story. But what if it's not even a story at all? What if instead of being disappointed by an absent plot, you settled into the moment now, really felt whatever you were feeling, and let that moment exist on its own terms, rather than trying to fit it into some artificial story structure? Well, if you did that, then you'd be doing what poets do, observing and writing from a lyrical paradigm, one that sees life not as a series of logical puzzles or a collection of stories, but as a great big heap of sometimes coherent, sometimes conflicting, but always somehow significant experiences. And of course, that doesn't mean that you have to like poetry, but who knows? When you see it for what it really is, you just might start to. But anyway, thanks for watching. This is one of those videos that I've wanted to make for a long time, but that I
I'll go
never
ahead and
really...
stop it here. So I like that little plug at the end, alongside the plug that popped up in the corner earlier. I'm guessing that this guy is a bit of a poetry apologist, and that if I look on his page, then I'm gonna see a lot of videos about poetry. I really liked this. I really enjoyed this video. I think that he's absolutely nailing it. I also really like how the way he frames it invites the viewer to kind of choose to come to their own conclusions. The way that I've been making stories and writing, I've been being a lot more like, this is the way things are. But he's able to kind of get across these feelings in a way that I resonate with more, in a way that's also concise. I'm guessing he's a professor, and so he's probably pretty used to framing this in a way that's inviting his students to look at it in this way, but also with a certain air of authority that kind of comes with the gig. I think he's absolutely right. I think that these poetic, the poetic structure it's not the same point that I was making, but I do like how it kind of goes a little hand in hand with this idea that, like, kind of like what I was saying, where a movie's beginning, I was saying in movies, but also just like a general story's beginning, middle, and end has these specific aims of bringing you in, introducing characters, getting a rising action, whereas like a game's beginning, middle, and end, like the beginning has a lot more to do with introducing game mechanics and giving you a driving purpose, and then the middle is about exploring the world, exploring the mechanisms, exploring what the game has to do, embodying the game, as I put it. And then the ending is a lot about, did you do this well enough? Did you learn the lessons well enough? We're going to test you and to see, hey, did you pass all of the things that you should have learned in the middle? And like the middle can be 2 hours or 40 hours, 100 hours, whatever. Whereas like with a movie or a narrative, that's a lot more restricted to, like, this needs to embody this much. And I think it's largely in part of what he's saying, this idea of like, I don't have to do this because that's what the character would do. I'm going to do this because that's what I want to do. Directly, I'm still going through my playthrough of Stellar Blade. It's taking me a long time because it turns out making videos is long, and so I'm not getting as much time to play that game or other games as I want. That's okay. But the thing that I've been doing lately is doing the photo challenges. And like, the narrative of that game is trying to press me forward. It is trying to be like, this is urgent, we need to save people. Yeah, I'm running around a desert taking selfies of fish, and I'm really enjoying it. And I think that it really inhabits that, like, that poetic aspect of being in the moment and enjoying things for what they are, not necessarily for what they contribute to the grander experience. So thank you so much for recommending this video. I really appreciated and enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon.